Hi, comrades. My apologies. Welcome to our discussion today, Venezuela, Left Perspectives from Below, featuring a conversation between Eva Maria and Simon Rodriguez. My name is Alejandro. I'm a member of Venezuelan Worker Solidarity, which is a collective of Venezuelan socialists in mostly the North American diaspora, who are trying to build relationships and promote the politics of struggles against oppression and exploitation back in Venezuela, from ecologists, anti-racist, feminist, and independent socialist perspectives, among others. With us today are Eva Maria and Simon Rodriguez. Eva is a Venezuelan socialist, feminist, and anti-racist activist who lives in Boston and has written extensively on Venezuela for a Jacobin and socialist worker. Simón Rodríguez is a Venezuelan socialist, a member of the Partido Socialismo y Libertad back in Venezuela, who's also the writer of this book, ¿Por qué fracasó el chavismo? There's a translation in English that we'll distribute at the end of the webinar. And welcome, everyone. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Eva. To start conversation, the agenda for today is essentially about 45 minutes to 1 hour of questions and answers with Simon and from both Eva and from the audience. So feel free to write questions in the chat and we'll process them as they come and pass them on to Eva. And yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alejandro. I obviously have never used this fancy webinar format because I just realized that I chatted to myself, welcome everyone. So I wanted to say welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this very important conversation. A special thank you to Simon Rodriguez, who's going to be answering most of the hard questions. I'm just going to be asking the questions. So I'm excited about that. So the way this is gonna go, as Alejandro said, I am also a member of Venezuelan Worker Solidarity. Alejandro has already talked about who we are and what we're doing, and the most important thing we're doing from the diaspora as Venezuelans is to basically build relationships with people inside of Venezuela, groups inside of Venezuela who are doing this very important work that we think is gonna be the essential work that we need to do in order to actually have an alternative to what we see now, that we don't think, as Venezuelan Worker Solidarity, we don't think that what we're seeing in Venezuela right now is socialism or is like a revolutionary government, which is why we were formed. And this is also why we're having this conversation today. And with that, I'm going to start. Well, first, thank you, Simon, for coming. Thank you. Hello.
Thank you, Eva and Alejandro, and everyone who's joining us.
First, I'm gonna start. Again, I'm gonna say thank you many, many times because these questions are questions that are complicated to answer. But the first question I wanted to start is what kind of has brought us to have this meeting right now, right? Which is one thing that is in most people's minds today is the question of solidarity. What does solidarity with Venezuela look like from outside of Venezuela? In the past couple of weeks, we have seen what some socialists think, what some people in the left in general think is the best way to show support. We saw a crew of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America members who went on a tour sponsored by the Venezuelan government. They were at a government event, they took guided tours and met a lot of government officials, including Maduro and Cabello. They took a lot of selfies. They're all over Instagram. This was heavily publicized by the official government press and TV channels as a show of support from the international left and specifically from the US left. This delegation has used social media to show amazement at what they consider is Venezuelan socialism. And so my first question to you is, does solidarity with the Venezuelan people and opposition to US sanctions, which we do oppose, imply support for Maduro in the government?
Thank you, Eva. Well, this is a crucial question that obviously not only the US left faces, but also European, Latin American, African, Asian leftists have to deal with this issue of what internationalism means, what does solidarity mean, and how to, in the face of this situation where a country such as Venezuela is facing sanctions and political pressure from the US government on one hand, but on the other hand, it's a situation where the working class is heavily persecuted. Union liberties are under constant attack from the government. It's a capitalist country by admission of even some people in the government would admit to that. So then what does it mean to being exercising solidarity for the Venezuelan people? We try to, for one thing, warn this delegation of the SA before their travel to Venezuela about what they would confront, because they portrayed this bicentenary Congress of, in Venezuela, we are celebrating 200 years of independence. What they would encounter in this international meeting, what they should expect, and also what we think really in the spirit of international solidarity should be done in a trip to Venezuela. And first of all, we warned that this was basically about self-promotion by the government. This was an official event sponsored by the government with people invited from the Chavista government and people linked to parties which are also linked to the PSUV party in Venezuela. So there shouldn't be any expectation of debate, plurality. No, it was an event to boast about international solidarity with the Venezuelan government. Also, we warned about the situation in Venezuela, which obviously you cannot perceive if you are in five-star hotels and meeting, the constant government propaganda, which is a reality of human rights violations, attacks on workers' rights, misery wages, really semi-slavery conditions for workers, wages of $2 a month, union leaders that are jailed, massive destruction of the environment in the Orinoco mining arc. There is basically a very fast destruction of the rainforest in Venezuela and the huge rivers that are being, eroded and destroyed for the extraction of gold. Full attack on the rights of women. Abortion is totally illegal in Venezuela. It's only allowed, not if the woman chooses, but if a medical doctor decides that her life is at danger. That is the only case where abortion is not criminalized. This is 19th century legislation. The police brutality, the massive murders of the youth in the barrios. Venezuela has one of the highest rates of police murders in the world. The actions of paramilitary death squads, even against what common sense could indicate, or if you see the mainstream media, what you might get the impression that everything is state-owned in Venezuela. Well, actually it's not. And there is a wave of privatizations that is underway by the Maduro government. We said all of these things in an open letter we sent several weeks before the trip, and unfortunately we didn't get any answer. But we also suggested that on their trip they should meet different sectors of the left, not only the government, but for example, critical Chavistas. There is this sector of Chavismo that is critical of Maduro, although they uphold what they call Chavez legacy. This encompasses the Communist Party of Venezuela. Homeland for All is another party. these are parties that have always been part of the the government coalition of Chavismo, but have recently started to present independent candidates in the most recent elections and have a semi-critical position regarding the government. And in spite being a timid opposition, we could say, or critical support, they have faced a lot of persecution, a lot of repression. So it would have been interesting for DSA delegates to meet them and to talk with them. Also, left opposition, Marxists who are in the labor movement, who are in the feminist movement, who every day struggle for things very similar to what the left in the rest of the country is struggle for. And finally, what we call this is for some coherence on what DSA's stated goals, principles, what its constitution and bylaws say, and basically to look for the people that fight for those same things in Venezuela, because we exist. It's not only people cheering for Maduro or people cheering for Trump. There are other things in life, and it was possible to do so. Unfortunately, they chose not to. But for us, then solidarity means rejecting imperialist aggression and US sanctions specifically, but also standing with the rights of the working class, of indigenous people, of women, the LGBTIQ community, which is also heavily persecuted, has no important gains to show in the last 2 decades to their legal rights. The struggle against racism, the solidarity with the indigenous peoples, all of these things for us is the embodiment of true internationalism, which is to side with your equals, with the people that belong to your same class, even if the frontiers that have been drawn by the bourgeoisie separate us.
Thank you for that very thorough response. I think it actually covers a lot of what I was gonna ask next. So I'm gonna try to get both questions together, because what you're saying, you're talking about the optics, right, of the government. And I think that's I think the piece that people get stuck. If you haven't been to Venezuela, if you haven't been to, even if you've been to Venezuela, but not outside of the 5 stars, right, in the hotel, and my guess, I think I know which one you're talking about too. It's probably yeah. So in downtown Caracas, right? If you haven't done that, then you probably only see what you receive, right? What we receive through social media, what we receive through the news, what we receive. And right now we're getting 2 things, right? If you're in the US, you have the optics of Trump and Guaido, right? In, and having their show, for a lack of other words, and then you also, but you have there is a sense, right? Where do you think this sense comes from of the government of Venezuela being actually a revolutionary government that is because all of these things have been associated with the government specifically, which is being pro-indigenous, anti-racist, feminist, eco-socialist as a government, right? What is this? So I guess my question is 2 things. One is where do you think this impression comes from? But also, is that the impression that the majority of Venezuelans have inside of the government? And, if you can explain a little why.
Yeah, well, it can be expected that if the government says it's socialist and revolutionary and anti-imperialist, and if also the right wing says the same thing, in Venezuela things are bad because of socialism and because there was a revolution, and this is what happens when you have a revolution, then it's inevitable for this common sense to be installed both inside and outside Venezuela. However, in Venezuela, we have the advantage that you cannot lie to people about their own experience. And people know that high government officials are millionaires. They see the grotesque privilege in which they live. They are not Che Guevaras. They are not people sacrificing anything for an ideal. They are cynical members of a rising sector of the bourgeoisie. They have become capitalists, many of them themselves. So it's in that sense, it's clear that we are dealing with a government that is not representing the working class or the working people, and that when they pretend to do so, it's obvious that they don't live on a $2 a month wage. You don't have to go into that explanation. You have to do it when you are talking with people who don't know Venezuelan reality, who live abroad and so on. But inside Venezuela, this discussion, you don't need to do it. There can be, of course, confusions as to if this is a consequence of socialism. If socialism is always a farce, some people can come to that conclusion. And of course, then we have an uphill battle then to explain that for us, really socialism was never attempted in Venezuela, because in our opinion, if the working class is not exercising power, if we are not changing fundamental relations of production, if we are not really dismantling the bourgeois state and replacing it with a direct democracy of the working people, the youth, the indigenous people, the peasants. If we're not doing any of that, then we are not advancing towards our own liberation. And on the economic level, of course, the main industry in Venezuela, which is oil, was never nationalized. It was the only moment when it was under workers' control was during the struggle against the coup and the oil sabotage in 2002, when workers took control of the industry to keep it in production and to defeat a coup d'etat and this lockout that was promoted by the capitalists to take down the government. But that was almost 20 years ago, and there has been a change in the situation, right? Now it's the Venezuelan government who appears in Bloomberg News, trying to present itself as the best guarantee of the recovery of the normal cycle of production of capital. It's a double discourse. Maduro says one thing to the audience that comes from the left of other countries, and he has another speech for Bloomberg and for Wall Street, and when he addresses the Biden government, etc., etc. So then, for us, it's very important to have a clear understanding of what the regime is in practical terms, and not only because we make some comparison between reality in Venezuela and some abstract principles or theories that we value as correct, but to compare what is happening on the ground in Venezuela and what the left always struggles for. This is a point that I want to make very strongly. It's not about comparing, a perfect utopia with a semi-problematic experiment that is going on and that has its problems and that it's facing pressure from imperialism, which is the way that Chavistas would portray what the government is doing. But to look at the facts and to see what are the class relations in Venezuela, to see what is the concrete situation of the working class, and how this has come to be even before the sanctions. Basically, to be honest and to be loyal to the Venezuelan people, you need to try to learn from this experience and from history, and not simply repeat slogans that really distort the reality.
Thank you. And I think that's the biggest thing, right? Like the honesty piece, like being honest with revolutionary struggles or, processes in general is not the most, sometimes it's not the easiest thing to look at or the most fun thing to look at or the most optimist thing to look at, but it's the only way we have, right, to get anywhere. with that, I am getting, so there is a video that we just received that I'm gonna ask Alejandro to introduce, if he can, with todas. No, not yet. Okay. Okay, that's actually great because I think the next question goes linked, like it's extremely linked to what you just said, Simone, specifically mentioning also just the economy and just kind of like the fundamentals of how things work, right? And my next question is actually about, similarly to the optics piece, right? That is, I don't know, there is like a before and now situation with Venezuela, right? There was, when I was doing most of the speeches that I was, or like my own process as someone who radicalized, right? And became a socialist, a revolutionary, someone on the left, trying to build a different world. Part of that was actually being inspired by Chavismo. And it was specifically inspired around some specific things that were happening at the time, which were, you know, when Chavez, I mean, around the election of Chavez, like the rhetoric around it being like against the two-party system, which I absolutely disliked and had no trust in, the two-party system that was before Chavez. Then there was also the momentum around writing a new constitution that actually had like things like indigenous people at the table, right? Like talking about their rights. And there was also what a lot of people have been really excited about around the misiones, right? Like these social work projects around housing, like giving housing to you know, like stable housing, right? Because it's very, if you've never been to Venezuela, but also like to any country in Latin, or to most countries in Latin America, the impression that you get, right, from having like, from seeing in the valley, like just in the mountains, houses that are not stable, right? Houses that if it rains, they fall, right? And like stuff like that, that seemed to be changing at the beginning of Chavismo. My question for you is like, what happened with that? Was that a real, you know, like what was that fake? Was that real? Like what is the early stages of Chavismo? What do you have to say about those early stages, and like what happens if you think it's like a drastic change, and if not, if you think it's a continuation, like can you actually explain a little bit more why, you know, like why did that happen?
Yeah, I like your experience, my own experience draws a similar trajectory, and I will only mention it because I think that many people in Venezuela, especially people on the left, have gone through a similar process, and it has to do with the Venezuelan history that you mentioned. There was a lot of discontent with the massive social inequalities of the bourgeois democracy of around 40 years after the military dictatorship of Pérez Jiménez in the 50s. And really a breaking point was the massacre of 1989. I was a very young kid, but I remember hearing the massive rains of bullets fired by the military against the slums and against the popular sectors. And of course, I was only 7 years old, but with time, I started to interpret what this meant in the context of Venezuelan politics. Really, it showed that this, you know, social democratic government of Acción Democrática and the social Christian sector of COPEI did not have any other way to respond to popular demands at that very dramatic moment than to send the military out to repress. That created a break in the army, although it was not immediate. Some years later, there were the military rebellions in which Chavez participated, And logically, he created great expectations because he was seen as someone who took action against a government that many people rejected, but perhaps saw no alternative. And this led to finally Chavez in 1998 winning the presidential elections. And there was a lot of enthusiasm, but what he reflected was the social process of struggle, resistance against, that political establishment. And the expectations were on two directions. One was democratic participation. There was all this discourse around participatory democracy because representative democracy was bankrupt. And the other thing was really social justice, having a policy to really let the people who were neglected and marginalized from this huge oil wealth to be able to gain access to a wealth that it was seen as property of the state. So basically, it was seen as if it was mainly a problem of distribution of the oil rent. Of course, this is not totally correct. This impression that we have that Venezuela has been a very rich country, only mismanaged. No, we always were a semi-colonial country, and just having wealth under the earth is not the same as being a rich country. But anyway, these expectations were reflected in this effort to self-organize by the working class. There were hundreds of new unions being born in the first years of the Chavista government, community radios, all sorts of community organizing was going on. And this was a very exciting moment indeed. Of course, the government was in contradiction with this because they came from the military. Many of the leaders of Chavismo, they have this very corporative conception of power. They don't like too much having people, on the initiative and organizing by themselves. But really, this contradiction between or inside the movement didn't come to a very violent resolution until the threat of counter-revolution, of a coup, was really defeated and was left behind. And this was quite clear when Chavez won the 2004 recall referendum and the 2006 his re-election, his first re-election. And it was around this time that he started to talk about socialism, 21st century socialism. Well, 6 years into his government, he started to say, well, we are going to invent a new type of socialism and so on. And he decided to create the PSUV party, which is the unified party, the official party of Chavismo. So in a contradictory way, when he started to talk about socialism, he was actually steering to the right in concrete terms when it comes to attacking the independent unions, attacking any form of independent organizing. When he created the PSUV, he said this party does not tolerate union autonomy. Union autonomy is a venom. It's a poison, counter-revolutionary poison. It will never be allowed. And there was this ideology, for development, we can have patriotic capitalists. And on the other hand, the unions, they are not very necessary because that's for capitalism. In socialism, you don't need really to fight for your wage. What you need is to take power, to participate in power. So they try to sell the illusion that somehow the workers would be participating in power by being in the PSUV or PSUV, how we say it in Spanish, by participating, in the political process. But this was divorced from the concrete gains and the rights of the workers as such. all of the process of creating this party was a process of really putting under the control of the state what were really the soul of the revolutionary process that started in 1989, well before Chavez came to power, which was self-organizing of the people, of the popular sectors, and of the workers. And we have to say that unfortunately Chavez succeeded in really destroying this process, and that's what allowed the government to make a reduction in more than 90% of the value of the real wage, to destroy unions, to confiscate them, to intervene them militarily, to jail a lot of union leaders and workers. And all of this process, there was never, a general strike or any real resistance, because the resistance had been broken in those years between 2007 and 2010. Many union leaders were murdered, many were jailed. Persecution was very important. The main union, which was the National Workers Union, or UNT, it was really divided and finally left very weakened. And after all of that was the moment when Chavez created this very corporative pro-bosses union, which is the Socialist Bolivarian Confederation of Workers. This was the process for us. We participated in the struggle against the 2002 coup. Jose Bodas, which we will listen to later, he's an oil union leader, Secretary General of the Federation of Workers of the oil industry. He was condecorated himself by Chavez for his role fighting against the 2002 coup. So we all come from this experience, fighting against the coup, fighting against the right wing, and trying to develop the experiences of self-organization of the working class and of working people. And it was really in that concrete experience when we came to the realization, to the need to break away from any sort of engagement with the government, because it was clear that it was a very anti-worker, anti-socialist government, even if it uses these words to cover itself and to try to have the prestige to destroy the process, the social process that had initiated in 1989. Some of the things that are many times referred to as the popular excitement and the massive support, it's of that early stage from 1999 and 2000 up until approximately 2007-8, and we have to say that the process of criminalization of the working class, the using criminal charges against people who were striking or who were protesting or who were taking lands, this is documented that it really took a lot of force in 2007. It was always a capitalist government, no doubt about that, but really the shift to the right started under the Chavez government and has gone really to limits which we would have never imagined 10 years ago under the Maduro government. Really, the Maduro government has taken all of these to extremes that are really, really impressive. The constitutional guarantees have been suspended indefinitely since 2015. These massive operations called Operation Liberation of the People, which means that the barrios are militarized and there are dozens of executions and hundreds of arbitrary arrests. This type of operations, this has been under the Maduro government. The massive use of paramilitary forces to attack popular protests like we saw in 2014 and 2017. This has been all an experience of the more recent years, especially in the context of really a deepening crisis which obviously has also to do with what Chavez did during the oil boom. The oil boom was not taken advantage of, and then the crisis was horribly mismanaged. They are two sides of the same coin.
My dad always quotes Slar Pietri when we talk about the oil boom not being used. Yeah, so I'm gonna thank you so much for all of this. There's a lot of information that I think it's all connected, which is why, you know, this interview like has a few questions, but they all have like a similar framework, right? Of like trying to get us at a context for the people who are curious about Venezuela from outside of Venezuela, and curious to know other perspectives other than the government-sponsored tour, right? Which you can take, I guess. But you know, if you would like to also hear other things, this is why we're doing this. We're going to play the video a little later. I think we're having some technical difficulties, so we're gonna push it back for another couple of questions. I do have two more questions, and then I want to just open it up for the Q&A. I already have a few questions from the chat, most of them actually related to the last question that I had for you around solidarity. So if folks have other questions and want to drop them in the chat, please, this is the time to do it, and then I will choose a few of them to, you know, for Simon to tackle. My question now, okay, so my question now is, so another thing that I realize is very different. Every time I go to Venezuela, just, you know, to visit, it's not the main question, but here it is a main question, which is questions around, so what happened to the things that seem very concrete gains, right? Such as, for example, this sort of mythological figure of Venezuela as a place where we're building a communal state. There's like all of these communes happening. There's popular militias. It's anti-imperialist, right? And it's also this idea, right, that it's financing world revolution, right? Like the hope of the government is for a world revolution to happen, and they are supporting those efforts. And that's an idea that people have here a lot about Venezuela. What is all of this? What you know, communes, all of these things that we hear about, is that real? Is that not real? Like, what's going on with that?
Well, it's important when dealing with these with these speeches to see the dimensions of things, because you could meet one cooperative that functions well, produces in the agriculture sector, and it's a positive experience. However, you have to look at the scale of things. You have to look at what the economy of Venezuela is, and then how does this concrete small experience fit in the larger picture, because then you can interpret what you are seeing. If not, it's very easy to be misled. So in the case of the Venezuelan economy, you have to take into account that there has been all of this promotion of nationalization, industries and enterprises that were taken by the Venezuelan state. This started also around the year 2007, 2008. But by 2014, and I take this year as a reference because it's before the drop in oil prices, which really became like the last nail in the coffin for the economic crisis in Venezuela. The distribution of the gross national product in Venezuela was 70 to 30, 70% private and 30% state. And the sector of the economy of production that corresponded to cooperatives and all of this sector of the so-called popular economy was less than 1%. And these are official figures. These are figures of the Venezuelan central bank. It's not anything we make up. This is what the government said. So this is at the best moment of you know, before the horrible crisis. that we have suffered. There is, of course, the idea that the crisis is solely or mainly the consequence of US sanctions. We have some images, which I don't know if we can share screen to look at them, because I think sometimes when you see the graphs and you see things in the time scale, it becomes very clear what we are talking about. You know, the first financial sanctions were in 2017, and the first oil sanctions were in 2019. But already since 2013, well before, we are in a recession, and we have been suffering very high inflation, the destruction of the wages of the working class, and really a really horrible, you know, situation. This, well, as you can just be showing them, and I'll comment what we are seeing. This is the production of oil, you know, in the last 2 decades or so. There is you see first a sharp drop. That's when the first coup attempts were in 2002. But then it sort of stabilized the oil production in Venezuela. We are reminding people that this is the main export in Venezuela, or at least it was until very recently, making up more than 90% of oil of total exports of Venezuela. So it's a crucial element of the Venezuelan economy. And we can see that production started to drop even before the financial sanctions and well before the oil sanctions. Of course, the drop accelerated after these sanctions, but it was dropping before. And this drop was important to know that the workers of the oil industry were warning that because of lack of investment in the oil industry, because of corruption, because of the model of joint ventures with transnationals like Chevron, like Repsol from Spain, all of these European and American enterprises participating in the looting of Venezuelan wealth, that this was affecting the capacity to produce oil. Also, there was no plan for transition. Now that this is something that is very much discussed, then the need to move away from fossil fuels. Well, the Venezuelan government never invested in anything that could remotely resemble, you know, a post-oil economy. If we can change the slide. What we're seeing now, this is you know, a graph made by the oil state-owned oil company PDVSA from Venezuela, where they show this part of the east of Venezuela, where they have what they call the oil belt, and the multinational companies to which they distributed these oil fields, which make up really the largest oil deposits in the world. But for Chavismo, this was simply an opportunity to become allied with these transnational capitals, and in a form of privatization, really, to divide it up and to give it to transnational capital, which could then put in its accounting, you know, that they own 40% of these huge oil fields, and therefore it favors the way that their books look when they go to the market. Let's change the slide, please. This is part of that brochure by PDVSA, and it shows in the map of Venezuela to the right places where there are oil fields, where you have the joint ventures, and they proclaim it with a lot of pride that it makes up 4% of the Venezuelan territory. These are huge extensions, more than 40,000 square kilometers. That's bigger than some countries even. If we can change the slide, please. These have been the crude oil prices since the 19th century, and they are measured both in absolute prices and in relative prices. What this graph shows is that Chavismo managed the biggest and most prolonged oil boom in Venezuela's history, and therefore it had a huge income. So we need to ask what happened to that money. Why is Venezuela depending on food aid now? Why do we need food from the World Food Program of the United Nations if we managed this huge amount of petrodollars? If we can change, please, the slide. This is this shows also year to year the growth and degrowth of the Venezuelan economy, and it shows that Venezuelan economy was shrinking very fast. It was falling long before the U.S. sanctions, and even when the oil price was above $100 a barrel. This is something that never before had happened in Venezuela. Always Venezuela had cycles of prosperity and of decay linked to when oil prices went up and when they went down. But with Chavismo, we achieved something unique, that was to be in a crisis when oil prices were very high. I don't know if this is the last one or if we have any other. Okay. Very small for me. Can you read what's there, Eva? It's about wages, I think.
What's in here in the graphic?
Oh no, it's the gross national product.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
he can. We can see here again that the size of the economy shrunk in a very important way well before the sanction. And there's one last, perhaps. This one is the one that has to do with the minimum wage, and also we can see how it shrunk in a very drastic way. I'll try to give a brief explanation of how all of these facts converge into a rational explanation. And the thing is this, as the oil price was going up and the income of the government was going up, the government devised this way to get, to get its hands on the oil rent and to loot, in a very direct way. And this way was to have a currency exchange rate which was artificially low. This means that since the government had the dollars, the petrodollars, and it decided to whom it would allocate these dollars for imports, basically deciding to who, for what, and in what amount it would give dollars to the private sector for imports. It was subsidizing imports rather than subsidizing production in Venezuela. That's a first problem. But the other problem is that when you got dollars that were so cheap, there is no commercial margin that you could ever hope to achieve in order to get profits as big as the profits that you were getting only from getting access to these very cheap dollars. It was almost free money. So what the bourgeoisie did, capitalists did, and people from the Chavista bureaucracy did, was they falsified imports. They asked for money for imports, and then the imports were not made because the business was just getting the dollars. And this led to the huge capital flight of those years, the draining of wealth outside of the country. This was massive looting, not only by Chavista bureaucrats, which they made a lot of money through this type of operations, but also the traditional bourgeoisie linked to the opposition and even multinational companies. This is something that many people would find surprising, and we, of course, don't ask anyone to believe us. If you have any doubts, do the research. It's not so hard. General Motors, this huge multinational that got bailed out during the crisis in 2007, 2008, got billions of dollars from the US government. In Venezuela, it was also getting dollars. Venezuela, a third world country, semi-colonial country with poverty, with hunger. It was giving the money to General Motors, and the company that received most oil dollars of this subsidized petrodollar system was precisely General Motors. They got $6 billion from the Venezuelan state through the years. Many other companies received a lot of these subsidized oil dollars. And the result is that today, when they are not receiving this money, they are not producing anything. General Motors doesn't assemble nothing. I mean, this was money that was lost. It could have been invested in agriculture so that we don't have to starve or to ask the UN for food. It could have been invested in infrastructure. So many things that have been done. And not only did Chavismo not do it, this is the worst type of capitalism, but it had the audacity to say it was building socialism. So I think that you have to take this into account. The cooperative sector of the economy is very, very small, and it has also been used in a dishonest way. For example, state companies that had their employees in their payroll with the union and with their salary, the wages, and all of this. Many times the government used cooperatives to use it as a form of tercerization. I don't know if this word is used in English. When you externalize, the labor, you go to a cooperative because then that's supposedly socialism, and you can get the same things done or paying less, and of course laying off the workers that had the formal relation with the company. So these types of maneuvers were very common in state governments, municipality governments, and also the national government. This doesn't mean that there are not heroic efforts by cooperatives that are striving to survive in the midst of this huge and horrible crisis, and they should be supported and have all of our sympathy. But to think that the Venezuelan economy is based on cooperatives is to not see reality. And the big sectors now, like gold mining or the oil itself, even if it's in ruins, it's still an important sector of the economy. None of this is run by cooperatives. The commerce is mostly private and big commerce. It's important to see the scales of things, and I hope that this explanation into the economic process, which shows that there was no break with capitalism and no break with imperialism, no break from semi-colonial dynamics, helps to understand what we are talking about when we say that this is a bourgeois reactionary government.
Wow. I've been both so as you were talking, you were actually answering a lot of the questions that came up. We have several questions and a lot of them have already been answered, as Alejandro is saying in the chat right now. If you have any different question now that a lot of them have been answered right now, please feel free. We're gonna go into closing after we show this video. Alejandro, do you think we're ready now to show the video? It seems like we are. Please do let us know if you can hear it, if it's not working well. We're all trying this technology.
Yes, so comments. So this is a video that Jose Bodas, who is the Secretary General of the Federación Unitaria de Trabajadores Petroleros de Venezuela, which is the Unitary Federation of Oil Workers of Venezuela, sent us regarding the condition of oil workers and the country from his perspective. Bodas was recently, after threats of illegally firing him for trade union activity, he was finally forced into retirement this past year, waking a lot of indignation in the independent trade union movement in Venezuela. After in 2019 and early 2020 was a year of a lot of movement for oil workers and for workers in general, which was met with, again, a wave of arrests, repression, firings, etc. So I'm very happy to have this video. Unfortunately, for different reasons, we're not able to A, have him live, and B, subtitle the video. It's going to be in Spanish and in a Oriental Spanish or from the eastern part of the country. So please bear with us, and I'll summarize for non-Spanish speakers at the end of the session more or less what he went through. But we hope to subtitle it in the next couple of days, but still. Oh, so sorry. Wait. Okay, sí, yes.
Hoy en Venezuela el salario de los trabajadores petroleros y todos los trabajadores de Venezuela son salarios de hambre que reducen a los trabajadores petroleros a condiciones de semiesclavitud. Un hecho concreto es que mensualmente ganan un salario de 6 millones de bolívares. Esto no es más que $2 mensuales. A veces son, digamos, 9 millones, que son $3 por los años de servicio. Aparte de esto, hay una política de destrucción del salario a través de las bonificaciones. Tenemos una bonificación de una vez mensual, que es la bonificación de solidaria para adquirir alimentos, que son 132 millones de bolívares, que aproximadamente estamos hablando de $45 mensuales, y también una bonificación de transporte, que estamos hablando de alrededor de 50 millones mensuales de bolívares, que son aproximadamente $15. Es decir, que los trabajadores petroleros no llegan a $52 mensuales. Aproximadamente un salario de $52 mensuales es un salario de hambre. No tiene nada que ver con el salario de un trabajador colombiano petrolero o de un trabajador de Trinidad y Tobago o Brasil. Es decir, un trabajador petrolero tiene alrededor de 1.800 a 3.000 dólares mensual, de acuerdo a la profesión, de acuerdo a los años de servicio. Es por esto que nosotros denunciamos la política de destrucción del salario que tiene el gobierno de Nicolás Maduro, que es profundización de la política de Chávez en lo económico, porque estamos viviendo un paquetazo antiobrero y antipopular que lo conforma el plan económico llamado por el gobierno de recuperación, de crecimiento y prosperidad económica, que es lo que es la destrucción del salario, la no discusión de las convenciones colectivas, las tablas salariales, es decir, que ningún venezolano puede tener más de 2 salarios mínimos, y cada salario mínimo no equivale a $2, es decir, es una política de destrucción del salario, de un paquetazo antiobrero y antipopular, y es por eso que los trabajadores venezolanos estamos movilizándonos y estamos luchando, y hay una política de criminalización. Por eso en Venezuela tenemos al capitán Bartolo Guerra, que está detenido, Eudi Girón, miembro de la Federación, Marcos Sabariego, Gil Mujica, Guillermo Zárraga, que están detenidos por protestar. Argenis Torrealba y Argenis Chirino y Argenis Torrealba. Es decir, por criminalizados por luchar por los derechos de los trabajadores venezolanos de 32 años de servicio en la refinería de Puerto La Cruz, en el estado de Anzoátegui, en el oriente venezolano. La industria petrolera venezolana viene atravesando desde el siglo pasado, desde los 90, una política de privatización que no se ha detenido, se ha profundizado. Primero, en el gobierno de Chávez, vimos como en febrero del 2007, esos convenios operativos del pasado pasaron a ser empresas mixtas en las fajas petrolíferas del Orinoco y en el lago de Maracaibo y distintos distintas áreas de Venezuela. Ahora, estas empresas mixtas, las transnacionales, tienen propiedad sobre nuestro petróleo. En las acciones son socias con el 40% de las acciones de estas empresas, es decir, 40% del petróleo venezolano. Esta figura, estas asociaciones con transnacionales, estas privatizaciones en concreto, vemos acá en Venezuela la Chevron norteamericana, la Halliburton, la Weatherford, es decir, cantidad de empresas transnacionales norteamericanas, petroleras. También está la Total francesa, la Statoil noruega, la Rosneft rusa, las empresas chinas haciendo esta situación. De verdad que estamos desde Secura, desde la clase trabajadora venezolana, desde el PCL exigimos una empresa totalmente estatizada, dirigida por la clase trabajadora de forma democrática, al servicio del pueblo de Venezuela, al servicio de aliviar la gran crisis. Hoy no vemos esto.
No puedo. How do you stop sharing?
Ahí estaba Selena.
So sorry, comments. As you can see, I'm not very good with technology. Thank you for bearing with me. So that was Jose Bodas. Some of the translation people already put in the chat, but essentially in the first part, he goes a bit onto how wages have been destroyed both by the crisis, but also by intentional policies of the government, leaving the formal wage to about $2 a month, which is compensated by a series of bonuses that are arbitrary, that are determined by the company, in this case by PDVSA, giving oil workers about $52 a month in total remuneration for their work, which is nothing compared to what oil workers in Trinidad and Tobago or in Colombia make, and that remains a hunger wage. It's not a living wage. He goes through a list of PDVSA workers in particular that remain under arrest, either in jail or under house arrest for protesting or denouncing acts of corruption. Among them Marcos Samariego, Eudis Irot, Argenis Chirino, Argenis Torrealba, and so on. Lastly, he goes into what are the demands of the particular trade union current that he represents, which is Secura, which are for PDVSA that is under Venezuelan control, that is in service of the people, that is democratically and transparently run, as opposed to one that serves the interests of transnational corporations, among them Chevron, Halliburton, that exploit both the Venezuelan soil and the Venezuelan people. And so with that, back to you, Eva.
That was extremely informative. In between this conversation with Simon and this video, I'm really, very thankful for this. And I want to move us now to some of the questions. And a lot of them, you've answered them already, Simon. I'm going to try to look into the ones that have either been only partially answered or might bear some repeating. So let's see. One of them is, honestly, most of them are about the same thing, right? Which is people want to help. People want to know what to do. People want to have specific concrete steps, right? So that's most of the questions where basically there's one of them here that says specifically actions that we can take from here in the US in solidarity with the Venezuelan people. And even more concretely around sanctions, we oppose US sanctions, right? There is a concrete question about do we oppose all sanctions, including there's no targeted sanctions that would be progressive around the Maduro government. So that's one of the questions that we can start with.
Okay. First of all, we have an understanding of what U.S. external policy is, and we have no expectations on it, because although the US government traditionally say that they are for democracy, they have been the main force against democracy in Latin America and also in other parts of the world, aiding dictatorships, financing, and even giving, you know, logistical support for coup d'etats. And this is not only, you know, faraway history from the early 20th century. We had the coup in Honduras in 2009, the coup in Haiti in 2004, which has led to the horrible crisis that even now we recently have seen some incidents of that, with the killing of a de facto leader in that country. Venezuela itself, when it faced the 2002 coup supported by George Bush. So for the US, it seems very clear that it's never about democracy. They have no problem being allied to the ruthless dictatorships like the one in Egypt or Saudi Arabia. You can get your head cut off if you're an atheist or you're a homosexual. I mean, these are the things that the US supports in the world. So they would have no problem with having a dictatorship in Venezuela if it was aligned with their interests. This has consistently been the case. So in this sense, we don't expect anything from US interference and would never call on it. There are two types of sanctions. We oppose both for different reasons. There are the sanctions that affect the Venezuelan economy, like the oil sanctions and the financial sanctions. The oil sanctions are worse because basically the US was the main, you know, commercial partner for the Venezuelan state. It was the main buyer of Venezuelan oil. But there are also sanctions against other companies that trade with Venezuela. So it's not only a limitation for US companies engaging in commercial activity with Venezuela, but also against third parties. We are opposed to this because, well, basically it also affects mainly the working people, making a situation that was already calamitous, it was already horrible, making it even worse. If economic crisis by itself would be enough to take down a government, then the Chavista government should have gone out of power in 2014, but it's not like that. It's not so automatic. So to try to make worse what is already the worst crisis in the Western Hemisphere economically is an irrational and a very cruel thing to do. But also regarding the sanctions that have to do with freezing assets of either the state or individual bureaucrats or government members. We have to be very clear about this. The freezing of Venezuelan assets has been used by US governments, especially Trump, which was the government that enacted these measures. They are freezing properties of the Venezuelan state and using the money for things like building the wall in the border with Mexico, or unspecified amounts of money have been invested in things like law enforcement. So they are literally doing piracy. They are, in Venezuela, we have a saying that if a thief robs from a thief, he gets 100 years of forgiveness. The US government is stealing from a thief and thinking that it's all right to do it. Well, it's not. It's still stealing from the Venezuelan people, and we reject this as piracy. When we restore finally some sort of democratic control or ways to make demands on a Venezuelan government, we would demand certainly actions for the recovery or for retaliations against the US if they do not give back the money that they have stolen and the assets that they have stolen. This could be done because the US has a lot of properties in Venezuela which could be frozen in retaliation. Obviously, Maduro is not an anti-imperialist to do this sort of thing, but things could be done in reciprocity. I don't know if that's a word in English, but in a proportional response. And there is another aspect when it's about individuals. Obviously, these fortunes that are in the U.S. and in Switzerland and in you know in Panama and all of these countries where they take the money to not pay taxes. We would like to know who these people are, what amounts of money they have, what properties they have bought, and what amounts of money they have, the riches they have amassed through corruption. But the US government does not disclose this information because it uses this information for negotiating. They see an opportunity to sometimes blackmail these corrupt people, get them into negotiations, get them to, you know, to jump ship and so on. And so their interest is never to, you know, to make this public and to have the intention of giving back to the people what has been stolen from them. So in that sense, we can't support it either. We would be in favor of it being publicly known where are all of the properties that come out of corruption and that they be frozen and really given back to the Venezuelan state at some point. But this is simply out of the question regarding the US politics, which is about piracy, is the word that I would use. So they should all be opposed, both on a political sense because of what the US is pursuing, which is to get into determining who rules in Venezuela, which we don't think it's the role of the US, and also because of what it's doing in the process. There is a wider question of what to do. Well, there are a lot of things that can be done apart from rejecting the sanctions. I mean, for example, Chevron is paying these $50 wages to Venezuelan oil workers. This is, I'm sure, illegal in the US for US companies to engage in slavery practices or semi-slavery practices. So the left could raise a very strong voice in the US to say, we will not accept that the Chevron company or other US companies super exploit in alliance with the Venezuelan government, the Venezuelan workers, and pay them misery for their labor. This is a very strong point that would only be made by workers or the left in the US or in other countries. There are Norwegian, French, Spanish, Italian, companies from all of these countries where if there was a solidarity movement, it could raise these demands to those governments to say, stop slavery practices in Venezuela in alliance with the Venezuelan government, because obviously this goes to the profit of these companies. So this is, I think, a very strong point. And another very important aspect of solidarity is to demand the freedom of jailed workers, feminists, indigenous people, peasants, to engage in the campaigns which exist in Venezuela, but to take it to the international level, to demand freedom for Rodney Alvarez, who has been 10 years in jail for a crime he did not commit, just for being a worker and for struggling for union rights, to demand that Vanessa Rosales, a feminist who is detained, accused of helping a teenage rape victim to get an abortion, which is illegal in Venezuela, to demand the freedom of oil workers who are criminalized for exposing corruption in Venezuela, to demand that the truth be told about the victims of forced disappearance like Alcedo Mora, the Vergel brothers, and other people, activists from the left and from other sectors that have been forcefully disappeared, to demand the freedom of human rights defenders who are accused with manufactured accusations of terrorism and of other ridiculous things. These are also very important things that should be and could be raised by revolutionaries, socialists, union activists, feminists, and so on in the US and in other countries.
Amazing. And with that, We also got two more more questions answered from what you just said. So thank you again so much for being so thorough. I'm going to pass to another thread of questions. So there's basically like 3 questions that we're trying to make one question that kind of helps with all of those 3 questions. What do independent socialist politics mean in Venezuela? For example, PSL, right? That's something that you are a part of. So what does PSL organizing work look like in Venezuela, but also other grassroots organizing, right? Like what's going on, what's the left opposition that is like currently in Venezuela? How many members are there? Are there like independent candidates being, presented by either PSL or other socialist organizations? And if so, like how many votes, like what's the influence of basically the left opposition in Venezuela?
Okay, so there's a social influence. For example, Bodas, who you heard, he's the Secretary General of this federation that represents more than 100,000 oil workers. So it's a very big federation, the most important strategically. There are bigger unions like the Public Employees Union or the Teachers Union have more members, but in the industrial sector, it's the largest and the most influential. So that's an example of how left opposition politics does open space for itself in the Venezuelan context. Also, because it would be good to differentiate, there are at least broadly 4 sectors that you could mention with their nuances and also their differences inside. But just for to simplify things a little bit schematically, because you have the sector that supports the government, the Maduro government. You have a sector that claims to be Chavista, claims to be trying to continue the legacy of Chavez, but that is critical of Maduro, where you would have the Communist Party and some other left parties. They do participate in electoral politics because although most of their legal representation was taken away by the government arbitrarily, they still have the possibility to have candidates through the Communist Party, which is the only one that was not taken away by the courts. What the government does is it uses the courts to give the legal representation of parties to members of the government, aligned parties. It's a sort of confiscation of parties. And then also you have a sector of Chavismo that is in the opposition, that is more closely aligned with the right-wing opposition, but they are still Chavistas. Some of them were ministers with Chavez or high officials with Chavez, and they think that it's important to be in alliance with the right-wing opposition, but still to claim to be Chavistas. So that's another sector. Then you have the right-wing opposition, the ones that believe that U.S. intervention is basically positive, and they rally around Guaido. They have their divisions, some sectors more to the right, some more center-right. You have a left opposition that is non-parliamentary, anarchists, Marxists, people who work in the unions, who are in the universities also, and that last sector is where our party would be located. Of course, we are not against unity in action, especially in the unions, in the defense of democratic rights, which often come together with critical Chavistas or people who are independent. If you wanted to see it more in a very broad sense, what the polls will tell you is that popular support for the government is around 10 to 15%, depending on the poll. And then people who define themselves as Chavistas would go up to 30, 35%. So that there are more Chavistas who are not Maduristas than the opposite. there would be a similar amount of people who identify with the opposition, and then you would have almost half of the population who would not identify either with the government or with the right-wing opposition. So there's a very important sector that right now is in a strong rejection of traditional politics and very disappointed at the traditional leaderships in politics. Right now, it's very, very difficult to do electoral politics, not only because of what I said of the narrowing of the amount of legal parties and parties that can have candidates, but also persecution. People who go as candidates sometimes get fired from their jobs. They are persecuted by the police. They are framed in false charges, regardless of whether they are Chavistas or not. If they are dissident, they are considered basically counter-revolutionary. The government, for example, has been very strongly attacking the Communist Party, which is basically giving critical support to Maduro, because they don't accept anything that is critical, even support they don't accept. They were accusing the Communist Party of being financed by the CIA, of being at the service of imperialism. The most ridiculous fabrications were being directed at them, and they responded in a declaration early this year when they said they feared that Maduro was sliding towards fascism. These are very strong words. This is what a sector of Chavismo is saying. It's not what we are saying. Just to make it clear. I think that also, just to wrap up, the aspect of clientelism is very, very strong and very important in Venezuela. When you talk about the communes, about the government programs and all of this, there is a very strong element of using the allocation of food and all of these subsidies as a way to pressure people into political discipline. If you do not obey, if you do not behave properly, you can get your food taken away from you. The so-called communes, they are totally controlled by the ministry that is in charge of the communes. You cannot have an autonomous commune. You cannot have simply organize a commune as a way for popular organizing to struggle for the issues that you want to defend in your community. It doesn't work like that. It's for members of the official party, and it's for special purposes, and whatever the government decides, when it decides that it will legalize a commune or not, it's always in the hands of the government. It's not space of popular struggle or organization.
And with that, we are 5 minutes away from finishing this event, and I just wanna basically give a lot of thank you. I'm very grateful to Simon for taking up so many of these very difficult questions. There are other questions that are mostly follow-up questions from things you've said. So I think it would be really useful if you wanted to share any contact information, if anybody wanted to reach out to you, if that's something you are comfortable with. We do, Simon Rodriguez is part of this collective, Venezuelan Worker Solidarity in PSL Venezuela, but also we have several ways to get to writings that members of our collective and friends have done. In the chat, there are 1 million different sources, so different things that you can, either if you are a Twitter person, if you're an Instagram person, if you are someone who needs to communicate just by email, that is all of these things are here on the chat. We can put them together also for Facebook for those who are watching live right now. There is also a feedback form that would be awesome for us to just know how we did, what you think, if you want other events like this. We have done a few other events like this, but one of the main things that we've done, right, is connecting with other comrades, other people who are doing work wherever they are, right? So we had a panel with feminists in Venezuela doing different things, right? And also with people working around environmental justice. And around Nicaragua too, we had, we also have a lot of people around the world who are facing different but also similar circumstances. So I'm extremely grateful. Are there any words that you would like to close us with, Simon?
No, also to thank you, Eva, and everyone who joined. We hope that this can spark new discussions, and are always happy to attend any invitation to discuss informally or more formally with activists and people who want to know more. I think the link to the book was shared, which is it's something that we worked on. Also, the Venezuelan Voices webpage, the Venezuelan Worker Solidarity blog. I think if anyone wants to reach out with more questions or any invitation for anything, the VWS email is a good way to contact us. And we are also active in Twitter, in Facebook with the Venezuelan Voices and Venezuelan Worker Solidarity social media. So I would leave it at this. There are many things that perhaps we did not address, but we don't want to make this like a Woodstock of 3 days, exhausting people.
The Woodstock on Venezuelan crisis. It's a little bit of a downer.
But hopefully it will lead to some reflection and to further reading and further research and involvement, because in the end this is about building a real solidarity movement and really building these bridges of solidarity and internationalism, which are so really crucial for all of us. So thank you again.
Thank you again. And it's really very important to us too, as Venezuelans who are with this specific view that like a lot of you are pointing is it's like a view that we don't see as much in the US. It's very important to us to know that you all were interested. It was a highly attended webinar, and we're very, very grateful. So that keeps us very hopeful. Thank you all. With that, we're closing. We are closing the webinar. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.